out. Yeah. Check it out. Check it out. Yeah. Okay, shout out to We Are Living Single. Ooh, in the 90s kind of world. I'm glad I got my girls. Keep your head up. What? Keep your head up. That's right. Anyways. Okay. Okay. Shout out to Maxine Shaw, attorney at law. Okay, the Maverick. Okay, period. Okay, yes. Anyways, don't mind me, y'all. And let's get right back into it. Where we left off, about to jump into the first official chapter. Excited? Okay. All right. Hopefully, this time my reading app will help me. Because yesterday or last night, okay, your girl was feeling good. Okay. Anyways, let's get for real, right on into it. Okay.
The efforts of white genetic survival, causing Spaniards to become darker in skin color, compared to the rest of the Europeans because of the long-term admixture of African black. During their occupation of Spain, the Moors damaged the efforts of white genetic survival, causing Spaniards to become darker in skin color, compared to the rest of the Europeans because of the long-term admixture of African black genetic material. Only with this understanding does the obsessive painting of the symbolic forms of the black phallus and testicles in a series entitled Elegy, Poem for the Dead, make fatal sense. Not understanding the underlying fear of white genetic annihilation, in the individual and collective white psyche, causes a mere surface interpretation of the paintings, even in the mind of the artist himself. Failure to reach the core issue of white genetic survival, resonating in the subconscious, which is most threatened by the genetic power in the genitalia of the black male, relegates interpretation to superficial levels with a failure to see and understand the symbols arising from that subconscious core. Motherwell addressed the issue of white, Western, survival in his comments on the Elegy series, specifically on Reconciliation Elegy. Against the background of possible nuclear holocaust, we must even reconcile ourselves to the fact that Western man, in choosing centuries ago to exploit nature rather than to marry her, has doomed himself with an industrial technology for which there is neither the wisdom nor the political mechanism to control. Yet, after having said all of the above, Motherwell still remains unconscious of the symbolic forms in his paintings. Indeed, the industrial technology and the nuclear weapons of which Motherwell speaks are designed by the Western, white, collective as protection against white genetic annihilation. Other Motherwell paintings of black figures against white backgrounds bear such titles as Africa, Study for Kilimanjaro and Ancestral Presence. This same concern and subconsciously perceived threat, in the white psyche, of black male, via black male genitalia, to white genetic survival is played out in the symbolism of the bullfight. In the bull ring, the bull is usually black. The bullfighter is usually a white male or any male in a suit of lights, meaning white. The bull is chased and tormented until it I killed. This killing goes on obsessively, as a symbol of white survival and the presence of the black male threat, symbolic of white males conquering black males or of white survival in a world populated mostly by on-height people. Further, we must understand symbols of communion. The Christian religion, the wine and bread that are eaten by the co-umkins are symbolic of the blood and body of Jesus, respectively. It is important to keep in mind that Jesus was an African, a black male whose color been changed to conform with the white supremacy perception and ideology. Finally, King Kong, the film in which a gigantic black ape plays opposite a white female, addresses in symbolic form the id of the black male to white genetic survival. Of course, King Kong is killed by the end of the film. The papers in this collection were written over the past 19 years. They are dated to give the reader some appreciation of the order in which they have LVE in my thought processes. They are of a whole cloth, all are derivative of the white supremacy power system / culture, which before now has not been understood in sufficient depth. Several essays address specific symbols in the white supremacy system / culture. I did not confound these symbols. On the contrary, I looked and there they were. Some have asked, why is it that others have not penetrated these deep symbols of Western culture? Why only you? My answer is that I neither saw these symbols nor understood their meaning until I had written the Kress theory of color, gerontology and racism. That analysis gave me access to the total spectrum of collective brain-computer products, symbols, log1c, thought, speech, action, emotional response and perception, that emanate from those who have established and maintained Western civilization. Having probed to the central core of Western civilization, one was able to see into, intuition equals intuit, the myriad energy phenomena that sm off-fro that dynamic core. Recognizing the specific injustice committed against non-white people in the framework of Western civilization and culture, it became clear that the entire Western civilization dynamic is fundamentally linked to the fear of white genetic annihilation and the subsequent need, as experienced by the global white collective, for the continuous battle against the genetically dominant global majority. 1415. Of black, brown, red, and yellow peoples. The organization for that survival is none other than the white race, which carries out the global system of white supremacy. Although initially it came as a great surprise, it is only logical that the myriad symbolic manifestations of the struggle for white genetic survival abound throughout the historic and global structure of white supremacy. These symbols manifest wherever one looks, wherever one steps and wherever one turns. That these subtle and once hidden symbols are everywhere serves as the strongest evidence of the validity of the Kress theory. It is as though I had written, if the Kress theory is correct, symbols so informing us will be found throughout the whole of Western civilization and culture. Indeed, without the specific theory, one can look at the symbols for decades and truly not know what one is looking at, even when one is handling the symbol in one's bare hands. One then might ask, why is it necessary to read a civilization or power system at deep levels? Western culture has produced much violence and destruction on the planet. It is like a cancer destroying the body. A physician attempting to treat or cure a disease, i.e., cancer, must examine the patient at deep levels. It is inadequate to stop at what is seen with the unaided eye. The physician attempting to solve the problem of a persistent and troubling cough in a particular patient may order X-ray studies to view the inside of the lungs and the chest cavity. He/she might perform a microscopic examination and bacterial culture studies on the sputum that comes from the lungs in order to understand the cause of the cough. When the cause is understood, chances that the disease can be treated effectively and cured are improved greatly, while that which is not understood in depth rarely can be treated or cured. Similarly, there are serious problems posed for the vast majority of humankind by the specific dynamic of Western white supremacy culture. I hope that this collection of essays will assist blacks and all other people, who have as their cosmic responsibility the resolution of the problem of injustice in the world, in identifying the problem of that specific injustice more clearly than ever before. Instead of engaging in FRPT practices of complaining, moaning, crying, groaning, begging, clapping hands and singing, we shall overcome when confronted with BLK these death-causing life-stultifying problems posed by HT. W1E supremacy, ACPE_OPAL and the US must dissect and analyze those problems to their core. WJTH this knowledge black people can take the necessary steps to eliminate the problem. Underscore those who will to work for justice and who understand that work as the conscientious responsibility will be found in all places and in all walks of life, at all levels of formal education and at all income levels. There are no CLS divisions nor language barriers for those who do this cosmic work. It is time to solve this problem once and for all. SN 1 Me 10 R Justice on THIEPA Net Earth 16 IFFI L.17 1 The Kress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy, a psychogenetic theory and world outlook. 1970 Unlike religion, the body of knowledge known as science takes the position that all observable phenomena can be explained, or, at least, is grist for the mill of investigation, analysis, and understanding by the human mind. In today's very small world, at least 3/4 of the people are non-white, and the members of this non-white majority population are subjected to domination throughout their lives, either directly or indirectly, by a tiny minority of the world's people who classify themselves as white. Racism, white supremacy, then, is revealed as one of, if not the most important observable phenomenon in the world today for which social, behavioral, and all other scientists should be seeking an explanation. Heretofore, racism has been defined and described variously, see Galati, Comer, Butts, and Pinder Hughes. Yet in my view, the comment made by Oliver C. Cox in his 1959 award-winning text, Caste, Class, and Race, Monthly Review Press, still prevails. It is not ordinarily realized that, of all the great mass of writing on race relations, there is available no consistent theory of race relations. The need for such a sociological explanation is so great that recently, when one author succeeded, with some degree of superficial logic, in explaining the phenomena in terms of caste relations, the college textbooks and social science journals, almost unanimously and unquestioningly, hurriedly adopted his theory. Perhaps social and behavioral scientists have failed to develop a sound and consistent theory of racism because of their tendency to be less demanding and less stringently disciplined in sticking to observable and measurable data than the so-called physical scientists are required to be in formulating hypotheses. Frequently, contrary to all the basic premises of modern science, statements are made by some of these scientists a priori, that is to say, claimed as valid independent of observation. Similarly, society, in general, fails to impose a significant amount of pressure on behavioral and social scientists to yield viable theories and definitions. Such theories and definitions subsequently can stand and function as efficient and effective tools to be utilized by social engineers as guides for changing social reality. However, the contrary seems to be the case. If there is any pressure at all, it is to maintain the social status quo. And all too often, institutions of the society reward the superficial, inconsistent, and dysfunctional theories of societal dynamics. Fuller, in his 1969 copyrighted The United Independent Compensatory Code/System/Concept, a textbook/workbook for thought, speech, and/or action for victims of racism, white supremacy, recognized the need for a functional statement on racism, one that could be utilized daily by those earnestly seeking to bring about social change. Fuller observed that, contrary to most present thinking, there is only one functioning racism, the known world white supremacy. He challenges his readers to identify and then to demonstrate the superiority or functional supremacy of any of the world's non-white peoples over anyone. Concluding that since there is no operational supremacy of any colored people, Fuller reveals that the only valid operational definition of racism is white supremacy. He observes that in spite of any and all statements the world's non-white peoples may make about themselves having economic and/or political independence and the like, in the final analysis, they are all victims of the white supremacy process. He places major emphasis on the present realities of the world that can be verified and tested, rather than on what one could imagine to be the case, such as a black or yellow supremacy. He further emphasizes that, instead of focusing on individual cases or on specific locations, a perspective that examines the patterns of relationships between whites and non-whites worldwide must be developed. Fuller explains that racism is not merely a pattern of individual and/or institutional practice, it is a universally operating system of white supremacy and domination in which the majority of the world's white people participate. He discounts the validity of theories that recognize the evolution of economic systems as the origin of this state of affairs. Instead, he reveals inadequate analysis of such theories by suggesting that Vanu's econom 1C systems, such as capitalism, communism, and socialism, have been devised, used, and reformed in the effort to achieve the primary goal of white domination. In other words, the goal of the white supremacy system is none other than the establishment, maintenance, expansion, and refinement of world domination by members of a group that classifies itself as the white race. Fuller then suggests that the word race, 11 in this sense, has little biological validity but is translated more correct. Y is organization, to the sole purpose of which is to maintain white domination and world control. Fuller's emphasis on the concept of color amplifies the assertion made in 1903 by W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps the greatest American social scientist, in The Souls of BLCK Folk, that the great problem facing the 20th century is that of the color line. Whether or not one is emotionally comfortable with Fuller's thesis and assessment is not germane. The question of such comfort never has been the important concern of scientific investigation. Of great significance in Fuller's work is the description of relationships between non-white and white peoples. Fuller defines and elucidates these relationships as a means of accounting for and illuminating many past and present observable social practices. Also, this examination reveals that, despite all kinds of programs and pronouncements to the contrary, for the past several hundred years, white supremacist social conditions have remained intact as the dominant social reality. Impressed that the concept of a system of white domination over the world's non-white peoples could explain the seeming predicament and dilemma of non-white social reality, I tended to focus, as a psychiatrist, on what possible motivational force, operative at both the individual and 1-, FL3. The Kress theory. #R the evolution of these patterns of social group. Levels, co-LD account ONTL function in all areas of human activity behavioral, practice that appear YT rudiment labor, law, po UCS, Lee religion sex, economics, educoon, NE. While Fuller clearly suggests a Th1, this system consists of R.C: Y:. Makes is that KOLE the reason that most white people hate BLPEP. Bytes are not black people. If people hate black people is cause W ed no little else if you KN this about white people UNE. UAA. One virtually all else that you know do not know this about white PEOPE, V about them will only confuse you. To take Fuller's account a step further, Ist Howell be noted that, in the ed. Euridic drive for superiority usually is found majority often stances, any D inferiority. Is it not upon a deep and pervading sense of quasi and small minority? One resent in numerical terms a very true that WH1TEPEOPE rep F daily is not white itself the very of the world's PEOE? And more PRONL re. Sun. Then, that the quality one resent in numerical terms a very true that WH1TEPEOPE rep.
Okay, so she got a little wonky there. So back a little bit above. While Fuller clearly suggests that this system consists of patterns of thought, speech, and action practiced to various degrees by the majority of the world's white people, the only comment on etiology he makes is that most white people hate black people. The reason that most white people hate black people is because whites are not black people. If you know this about white people, you need know little else. If you do not know this about white people, virtually all else that you know about them will only confuse you. To take Fuller's account a step further, it should be noted that in the majority of instances, any neurotic any neurotic drive for superiority usually is found upon a deep and pervading sense of inadequacy and inferiority. Is it not true that white people represent, in numerical terms, a very small minority of the world's people? And more profoundly, is not white itself the very absence of any ability to produce color? I reason then that the quality of whiteness is indeed a genetic inadequacy or a relative genetic deficiency state based upon the genetic inability to produce the skin pigments of melanin, which is responsible for all skin color.
F daily is not white itself the very of the world's PEOE? And more PRONL re. Sun. Then, that the quality of absence of any ability to PRCE echo UAY or a relative genetic deficiency whiteness is indeed a gene nukma. F state, based upon the genetic inability to produce the SK : equals E-lenin, which is responsible for all SKM color. The vast J. Y Almi. DHH suggests that color one's not.
The vast majority of the world's people are not so afflicted, which suggests that color is normal for human beings and color absence is abnormal. Additionally, This state of color absence acts always as a genetic recessive as a genetic recessive to the dominant genetic factor of color production. Color always annihilates phonetically, phenotypically, and genetically speaking the non-color white. Black people possess the greatest color potential with brown with brown, yellow, red with brown, red, and yellow peoples possessing lesser quantities respectively. This is the genetic psychological basis for the Crest theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. Let's see if she gets back in order.
The color confrontation theory states that the white or Europeans responded psychologically, with a found SESE of cal inadequacy and color inferiority.
The color confrontation theory states that the white or color deficient Europeans responded psychologically with a profound sense of numerical inadequacy and color inferiority in their confrontations with the majority of the world's people, all of whom possess varying degrees of
in their confrontatlo SWL, majority of the world's people, all of whom possessed varying of color producing capacity. This psychological response, whether conscious or unconscious, revealed an inadequacy based on the most obvious and fundamental part of their being, their external appearance. As might be anticipated in terms of modem psychological theories, whites defensively developed an uncontrollable sense of hostility and aggression. This attitude has continued to manifest itself throughout the history of mass confrontations between whites and people of color. That the initial hostility and aggression came only from whites is recorded in innumerable diaries, journals, and books written by whites. Also, records indicate that only after long periods of great abuse have non-whites responded defensively with any form of counterattack. This perplexing psychological reaction of whites has been directed towards all peoples with the capacity to produce melanin. However, the most profound aggressions have been directed towards black people, who have the greatest color potential and, therefore, are the most envied and feared in genetic color competition. The experience of numerical inadequacy and genetic color inferiority led whites to implement a number of interesting, although devastating, to non-white peoples, psychological defense mechanisms. The initial psychological defense maneuver was the repression of the initial painful awareness of inadequacy. This primary ego defense was reinforced by a host of other defense mechanisms. One of the most important of these defense mechanisms was reaction formation, a response that converts, at the psychological level, something desired and envied but wholly unattainable, into something discredited, despised. The whites, desiring to have skin color but unable to attain view, consciously or unconsciously, that skin color was disgusting, and began attributing negative qualities to color, especially to, interestingly, the 10 non-white is a double negative result. A positive statement. This is perhaps a Freudian slip, wherein the QJJ and UAE ultimately reveals the primary psychological dynamic. To have colored skin can be observed at the very first signs or summer when they begin to strip off their clothes, as many law will allow, often pending their skins to be burned, attempt to add some color to their pale bodies and rendering themselves vulnerable to skin cancer in the process. Most cosmetics are also an attempt to add color to white skin. Such coloring makeup is provided for the white male as well as female. And finally, untold millions are spent annually on chemicals that are advertised as being able to increase the tanning potential of whites. The fact that some blacks have attempted to change the color of their skin to white does not mitigate the force of T's argument, as it can be demonstrated readily that these non-whites are responding to the already established social conditions of white supremacy. Such a process, as seen in blacks and other non-whites, may be described as identification with the oppressor. Another example of the reaction formation defense is the elaboration of the myth of white genetic superiority, which continues to be reinforced assiduously. Note Jensen's latest elaborations and their acceptance at all levels of the white social structure. Acutely aware of their inferior genetic ability to produce skin color, whites built the elaborate myth of white genetic superiority. Furthermore, whites set about the huge task of evolving a social, political, and economic structure that would support the myth of the inferiority of blacks and other non-whites. An additional psychological defense maneuver utilized by whites has been that of projection. Feeling extreme hostility and hate towards non-whites, whites began the pattern of stating that non-whites hated them. In many instances, this mechanism has served to mitigate the guilt whites occasionally experience for their impulse to aggress against blacks and other people of color. Another, perhaps special, instance of the use of projection is the historic and continuing desire of whites for sexual alliances with non-whites, a desire indulged by white males throughout the world. This deep desire has been projected onto black males and females, and is manifest in the notion that people of color have sexual desires for white males and females. The color confrontation theory postulates that whites desired and still do desire sexual alliances with non-whites, both male and female, because it is only through this route that whites can achieve the illusion of being able to produce color. The extreme rage vented against even the idea of a sexual alliance between the black male and the white female, which has long been a dominant theme in the white supremacy culture, is viewed by color confrontation theory as a result of the white male's intense fear of the black male's capacity to fulfill the greatest longing of the white female, that of conceiving and birthing a product of color. One, there are other sexual behaviors practiced by some whites that can be illuminated by the color confrontation thesis. For example, in his autobiography, Malcolm X stated that the sexual perversion he was asked to perform most often by white men was for him, as a black male, to have sexual intercourse with white females in their presence, while they, white men, looked on. This behavioral pattern on the part of white males, instead of being dismissed as a perversion, can be understood when viewed as white males' fantasized identification with black males' capacity to give conceptual products of color to white females, something white females desperately desire but white males cannot fulfill. Further vivid testimony is given by black males who have engaged in sexual intercourse with white females. These men report that a frequent utterance of white females is that they wish to have black babies. The color confrontation theory also explains why black males' testicles were the body parts that white males attacked in most lynchings. The testicles store powerful color-producing genetic material. Likewise, the repeated and consistent focus on the size of black males' penises by both white males and females is viewed by this theory as a displacement of the fundamental concern with the genetic color-producing capacity residing in the testicles. Since the fact of colorativity must remain repressed, color desire can never be mentioned or the entire white psychological structure collapses. Therefore, attention is displaced to a less threatening object or symbol, the penis. Finally, the degradation of sex in the white supremacy culture allows for yet another area of insight into the fundamental psychological dynamics of whites and their self-alienation regarding their physical appearance. At the most primordial level, sex can be viewed as the reproduction of one's own image, of self, and of kind. According to the color confrontation theory, white supremacy culture degrades the act of sex and the process of self-reproduction, because for whites both are reflective of whiteness and, in turn, their inability to produce color. This self-deficiency clearly is despised and is stated most explicitly in the religious and moral philosophies of the white supremacy culture. Yet, this manner of degrading the sexual act is not found in non-white cultures. In fact, the very opposite is the case. The act of reproduction is held in the highest esteem, as reflected in non-white arts and religious practices. The artistic and religious practices of India and Africa give strong and continuous testimony to this fact. In whites, this initial core feeling of alienation from themselves and from the act that produced their image found subsequent expression in their thought processes, religious philosophies, moral codes, social acts, and the entire social structure. Psychiatrists and other behavioral scientists frequently use the patterns of overt behavior towards others as indications of what is felt fundamentally about the self. If hate and lack of respect are manifested towards others, hate and lack of respect are felt most often at deeper levels towards the self. Facets of other behavioral patterns within the white supremacy cultural framework support this thesis. For example, many white writers, in all areas of the world, experience and write about their profound sense of self-alienation. Additionally, some of the current political, social, and behavioral activity enacted by whites against the ideology and values of the white social structure, although not spoken of in the terminology used here, can be appreciated at one level as an expression of the same kernel of alienation against whiteness. Thus, the hippies and yippies, by allowing dirt to accumulate on themselves, in one sense, are adding color to their skins. They also, by allowing their head and facial hair to pro-life TE, cover themselves with the only part of their bodies that has substantive color, their hair. The present frantic attempts made by whites to counter this sense of alienation take the form of free and open sexual practices and sexual orgies. Such attempts will be unsuccessful because, again, the core problem is a sense of alienation primarily from their own lawlessness, and secondarily from the social practices and structure whites have BMLT around that psychological core over the centuries. Racism, white supremacy, having begun as a form of self-alienation, has evolved into the most highly refined form of alienation from others as well. The color confrontation theory views all of the present battlegrounds in the world as vivid reflections of this reality, the destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns being displayed by white peoples towards all non-white peoples is evidence of the inner hate, hostility, and rejection they feel towards themselves and of the depth of self-alienation that has evolved from the genetic and psychological kernel of color inadequacy. The mass inability of whites to live and attend school in the presence of non-whites is expressed in the patterns black and white housing and education throughout this country and the world. In terms of the color confrontation thesis, this inability is seen as the apparent psychological discomfort experienced by whites in situations where, in confronting their neighbors of color, they must face their color inadequacy daily. Also, the myth of white superiority is exploded in the presence of equitable social and economic opportunity. The white personality, in the presence of color, can be stabilized only by keeping blacks and other non-whites in obviously inferior positions. The situation of mass proximity to blacks is intolerable to whites because blacks are inherently more than equal. People of color always will have something highly visible that whites never can have or produce the genetic factor of color. Always, in the presence of color, whites will feel genetically inferior. The difficulty whites have in according non-whites socio-political and economic equality within the white supremacy structure stems neither from a moral issue nor from political or economic need, but from the fundamental sense of their own unequal condition, in regards to their numerical inadequacy and color deficiency. They can compensate for color inadequacy only by placing themselves in socially superior P0SI1NS. The color inadequacy of whiteness necessitates a social truce based on white superiority. Only tokenism can be tolerated by such a non-observational psychological state, wherein the pollution of the myth of the KCE-DIN.al. Non-white is used, again, as a defense mechanism. The thrust towards superiority over peoples of color, the drive towards material accumulation, the drive towards a technological culture and the drive towards power are all cornerstones of the universal white supremacy culture, and they are viewed in terms of the color confrontation thesis. As responses to the core psychological sense of inadequacy, this inadequacy is not measured in terms of infant size as compared with that of the adult, as postulated by Alfred Adler. Rather, it is an inadequacy rooted in the inability to produce melanin. This genetic state is, in actuality, a variant of albinism. The color confrontation theory further postulates that whites are vulnerable to their sense of numerical inadequacy. This inadequacy is apparent in their drive to divide the vast majority of non-whites into fractional, as well as frictional, minorities. This is viewed as a fundamental behavioral response of whites to their own minority status. The white race has structured and manipulated their own thought processes and conceptual patterns, as well as those of the entire non-white world majority, so that the real numerical minority, whites, illusionally feels and represents itself as the world's majority, while the true numerical majority, non-whites, illusionally feels and views itself as the minority. Interestingly, the white collective, whenever discussing the question of color, never discusses any of its own particular ethnic groups as minorities, but constantly focuses on the various ethnic, language and religious groups. of non-white peoples as minorities. Then great efforts are made to initiate conflict between these arbitrary groups. This is one of the key methods by which a minority can remain in power. The divide, frictionalize, and conquer pattern, observable throughout history wherever non-whites are confronted by whites, results primarily from whites' sense of color deficiency and secondarily from their sense of numerical inadequacy. This pattern, then, is a compensatory adjustment to permit psychological comfort through dominance and control. See Diagram 1. Similarly, the present-day frantic focus on birth control for the entire non-white world is another example of white people's conscious or unconscious awareness of their numerical deficiency status. There is never great emphasis on the psychogenetic and social dynamic of racism, white supremacy, genetic factor, color inadequacy state, white, and albinism or variant. Individual and group psychological response, development of psychological defense mechanisms, compensatory logic system, white supremacy, compensat, behavioral practices, economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, war, white supremacy behavioral system and culture. On worldwide scale, systematic appreciation, domination, and inferiorization of OPEOLETH, the capacity to produce significant amounts of melanin SKM pigment, black, brown, red, and yellow peoples of the earth. Diagram by controlling the births of whites. In fact, there are some white governmental groups that give dividends to citizens for increased procreation. The above are but a few examples selected from millions of large and small behavioral patterns practiced by whites in varying quantities. Yet, these examples effectively demonstrate the individual and collective neurotic need to focus on color, sex, genetics, numbers, superiority/inferiority, white supremacy, and power. The color confrontation theory contends that all of the above can be explained on the basis of the core psychological sense of color deficiency and numerical inadequacy. The individual patterns of behavior that, over time, evolved into collective, social, institutional, and now systemic patterns are seen as the origin of the system of white supremacy, which operates at a universal level and is the only effective and functional racism existent in the world today. Further, racism, white supremacy, in this historical epoch, is viewed as a full-blown social contradiction and the major social dynamic superseding all others and influencing universal social practices and decisions. The color confrontation theory recognizes racism as one of the dominating forces determining character development, personality, and formation type. Therefore, a functional definition of racism, white supremacy, is the behavioral syndrome of individual and collective color inferiority and numerical inadequacy that includes patterns of thought, speech, and action, as seen in members of the white organization, race. What then are the practical implications of this theory? Of major importance is the fact that for the first time in centuries non-white peoples throughout the world will have a rational basis for understanding the motivational nuances of individual and collective white behavior. The color confrontation thesis theorizes that the majority of the world's people, non-whites, were manipulated into subordinate positions because, never having experienced such a state in terms of their own thought and logic processes and premises, they were unprepared to understand patterns of behavior predicated upon a sense of color deficiency and numerical inadequacy. This is analogous to the man with two eyes finding it difficult, if not impossible, to understand the behavioral patterns and motivations of the congenitally one-eyed man, who always looked upon the two-eyed state with jealous antagonism and, perhaps, aggression. Armed with such insight, knowledge, and understanding, non-whites will cease to be vulnerable to the behavioral maneuverings of individual or collective whites. Non-whites will be less vulnerable to the messages of white superiority that radiate throughout the known universe and permeate world cultures, which are dominated by the white supremacy system. This understanding will have profound effects on the developing egos and self-images of all non-white children, who suffer severe damage under the white supremacy culture. Moreover, whenever they are confronted by the ideology of white superiority/supremacy, non-whites will understand that it is only a compensatory psychological adjustment for a genetic, numerical deficiency state, thus the white supremacy message can be evaluated and negated more readily. This allows non-whites to gain psychological liberation from the white ideological domination that negatively affects the total functioning of non-whites. Further, non-whites will be less vulnerable to being maneuvered into conflict with one another, thus weakening the continued domination of the white supremacy system. Also, white peoples of the world presumably also could benefit from such an awareness of the motivation behind behaviors that often baffle them. If they are sincere in their attempts to stop the practices of white supremacy, racism, whites may be able to find methods to do so once the cause is understood. Perhaps some psychiatrist will develop a method of mass psychotherapy, i.e., therapeutic counter-racist theater, to help whites become comfortable with their color and their numbers. However, one can foresee a major problem arising from the possible difficulty of motivating whites to release the secondary gains historically derived from the racist system. The possibility of white people accepting this analysis of the white problem in human relations is not for me to answer. I do know that the majority of the world's people are looking for an answer to the dilemma that was once called the American dilemma. They are looking for a change. Perhaps the Kress theory of color C confrontation will help them. 1213. To make that change. In any event, I am reminded of a statement made by Freud's biographer, Ernst Jones, in the last analysis. The justification of every scientific generalization is that it enables us to comprehend something that is otherwise obscure. 6. And, as James B. Conant has stated, the test of a new idea is, not only its success in correlating the then known facts but much more its success or failure in stimulating further experimentation or observation which in turn is fruitful. This dynamic aspect of science, viewed not as practical undertaking but as development of conceptual schemes, seems to me to be close to the heart of the best definition of science. This essay analyzes the unique universal behavioral phenomenon of white supremacy, racism, and places it in a conceptual framework and context of a theoretical formulation. The fundamentals of the dynamics inherent in the spectrum of relations cover all areas of life activity between people who classify themselves as white, and those people whom whites have classified as non-whites. References. 1. Galati, A.C. The Subtleties of White Racism. A paper presented to the American Psychiatric Association Annual Meeting, Miami Beach, Florida, May 1969. 2. Comer, J. White Racism, Its Roots, Form, and Function, The American Journal of Psychiatry, Volume 26, Number 6, December 1969. 3. Harrison, P.A., Butts, H.F. White Psychiatrists' Racism in Referral Practices to Black Psychiatrists, Journal of the National Medical Association, Volume 62, Number 4, July 1970. 4. Pinder Hughes, Charles A. Understanding Black Power, Processes and Proposals, American Journal of Psychiatry, Volume 125, 1552-1557, 1969. 5. Cox, O.C. Caste, Class, and Race, New York, Monthly Review Press, 1959, p. 9. 6. Fuller, N. The United Independent Compensatory Code/System/Concept, Copyrighted, Library of Congress, 1969. 7. Fuller, N. The United Independent Compensatory Code/System/Concept, Copyrighted, Library of Congress, 1969. 8. X. Malcolm, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, with the assistance of Alex Haley. New York, Grove Press, 1966, p.L. 20. 9. Jones, E. Papers of Psychoanalysis, Boston, Beacon Press, 1961, p. 73. 210. Conant, J.B. On Understanding Science, New York Mentor. 1953. The Origin of Alienation, Anxiety, and Narcissism, August 1980. Dedication. This essay is dedicated to Genevieve Ikaet, a Nigerian journalist who, because of the profound pain of alienation, took her life on June 25, 1978 while residing in the United States of America. The world lost a brilliant mind and a generous person. Shortly before her death she stated, "My superstructure is solid. I need a formidable foundation." This essay is my contribution to our understanding of the destructive dynamic of alienation. Psychiatry as a discipline is floundering on its previously established conceptual and theoretical foundation imported from 19th century Europe. My continuing question to myself as a late 20th century precautionary in general and child psychiatry, practicing in the power capital of the world, Washington, D.C., is, can a greater understanding be achieved in the study of human behavior as it is organized and manifested in the world's dominant power system/culture? My answer is affirmative. We can derive an ever-increasing level of order out of the existing chaos, a diagnostic and statistical manual that gets heavier and wordier with each effort. Thereby, we can enhance our diagnostic and treatment skills and increase the possibility of prevention, allowing us to serve a suffering humanity better. In Have Astronomers Found God? Robert J. Astro states, "There is a kind of religion in science, it is the religion of a person who believes there 16. Is order and harmony in the universe, and every event can be explained in a rational way as the product of some previous event. Every effort must have its cause." Jastrow continues, taking a quotation from Albert Einstein, "The scientist is possessed by the sense of universal causation. As a social and behavioral scientist, I am convinced it is possible to understand, in depth, the patterns and system of behavior encountered in the individual and in the broad collective. My further conviction is that we can serve humankind maximally as behavioral scientists and physicians only when we adequately analyze the fundamental causation and logic of these patterns of behavior." Three major foci of attention in Western social and behavioral science, particularly in psychiatry: alienation, anxiety, and narcissism, are not unrelated, isolated syndrome abstractions, as they have been discussed by Western social and behavioral scientists. These separately described phenomena are not only interrelated, but they have a common origin and cause. They are derivatives of the same causal dynamic. Although that causal dynamic has remained unidentified, the source of these three phenomena is the origin of Western civilization itself: alienation. In the color confrontation theory, I stated that racism, white supremacy, having begun as a form of alienation towards the self, now has evolved into the most highly refined form of alienation towards others as well. The color confrontation theory views all of the present battlegrounds in the world today as vivid reflections of this alienation towards others. The destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns displayed throughout the world by white peoples towards all non-white peoples is the evidence of the inner hate, hostility, and rejection they feel towards themselves and of the deep self-alienation that has evolved from their genetic inadequacy. My extended definition of alienation centers around the recognition that it is a fundamental behavioral dynamic in Western civilization and culture. Alienation is a powerful centrifugal, genetic, psychological, and societal dynamic that, over time, drives human beings further and away from all effective, meaningful, emotionally supportive, and truthful communications amongst one another. The alienation dynamic increasingly forces people away from one another as Western civilization and culture evolves, as seen through each successive generation since its origin, including Greek civilization and the Roman Empire. Alienation is the very same dynamic that pushes human beings away from respectful and harmonious relationships with the physical environment, leading to the pollution and destruction of the planet. Most important, the alienation dynamic forces the individual away from all manifestations of self-understanding and self-respect, including the most fundamental respect for one's genetic makeup. The Encyclopaedia Britannica records that the roots of the idea of alienation are found in the works of Plotinus, a Roman philosopher born in Egypt, who lived between 205 and 270 AD, as well as in the theology of both St. Augustine and Martin Luther. The latter addressed the struggle to alienate oneself from one's own imperfections by identification with a transcendental perfect being. Entries on alienation did not appear in major reference books of the social sciences until 1935, but the concept of alienation was present in classical sociological texts of the 19th and early 20th centuries in the works of Marx, Durkheim, Tönnies, Weber, and Simmel. Eric and Mary Josephson, in their Man Alone, Alienation in Modern Society, had the following to say about alienation. Indeed, ever since the great technological and political revolutions of the late 18th century, with their shattering impact on a rigid social order and their promise of individual freedom, one of the most disturbing phenomena of Western culture has been man's sense of estrangement from the world he himself has made or inherited, in a word, man's alienation from himself and from others. This theme of the alienation of modern man runs through the literature and drama of two continents. It can be traced in the content as well as the form of modern art. It preoccupies theologians and philosophers, and to many psychologists and sociologists it is the central problem of our time. In various ways they tell us that ties have snapped that formerly bound Western man to himself and to the world about him. In diverse language they say that man in modern industrial societies is rapidly becoming detached from nature, from his old gods, from the sea technology that has transformed his environment and now threatens to destroy it, from his work and its products, and from his leisure, from 1819. The complex social institutions that presumably serve but are more likely to manipulate him, from the community in which he lives, and above all from himself, from his body and his sex, from his feelings of love and tenderness, and from his art, his creative and productive potential. Contemporary contributors to the definition of alienation include such thinkers as psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, philosophers Louis Mumford and Herbert Marcuse, existentialists Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Paul Tillich, and Martin Buber, and sociologists David Reisman, Robert K. Merton and Talcott Parsons. In summary, there are at least 5 causal theories concerning alienation: the economic, the technological, the sociological, the philosophic/existential, and the psychological. Karl Marx is identified with the economic theory. Marx viewed alienation as a result of the private ownership of the means of production and the expropriation of man's labor by the capitalists, resulting in worker exploitation and class struggle, money and commodities becoming the most meaningful things in man's existence and thus man's alienation from man. Technological theories attribute alienation to man's adjusted lifestyle to machines and automation. Sociological theories view the decline of the limited local community, the emergence of mass society, and the simultaneous increasing sense of individual powerlessness as the cause of alienation. Philosophic/existential theories emphasize that alienation is inherent in the finite and isolated character of man's existence as a stranger and an alien in the world. Psychologic theories are dominated by the views of Sigmund Freud, who viewed alienation or self-estrangement as a resultant of the split between the unconscious and the conscious forces in the personality, the individual thus being out of touch, in the sense that repressed and unacknowledged desires motivate his behavior. More specifically, Freud pinpointed the Oedipal conflict and the frustrations inherent in civilized society, as expressed in his Civilization and its Discontents, as the source of alienation. The following are but a few items from a long list of suggested manifestations of alienation: child abuse, psychosis, suicide, neurotic depression, delinquency, psychosomatic disorders, prejudice, civil riots, wildcat strikes, and the rise of fascism. All are believed to have derived from one or more of the following states: social isolation, self-estrangement, a sense of powerlessness, meaninglessness, normlessness, and cultural estrangement. Whereas I agree with the existence of the alienation dynamic in Western civilization and culture, I disagree with all of the aforementioned theories of its causation. These theories remain superficial in their analyses, as each fails to reach the core of the origin of Western civilization. The multiplicity of theories on such a basic and pervasive dynamic as alienation reflects the failure to comprehend the origin and nature of Western man, who has created at conscious and unconscious levels the totality of the Western cultural imperative. With a sufficiently deep investigation, the myriad aspects of the alienation dynamic that on the surface appear unconnected are recognized as highly interrelated and tied to a central core, a unitary causation. Anxiety and narcissism are tied to that same fundamental core, as illustrated in the following diagram. The three-dimensional cone-shaped figure represents the multiple levels at which reality, phenomena, may be decoded. The dots on the surface at level 5 represent the seemingly isolated, multiple phenomena that can be examined at ever-increasing levels of depth, indicated by levels 4 through 1. The basic interconnections between the isolated phenomena are less apparent at level 5 than at level 2 or level 1. The interconnections, however, become increasingly clear as a greater depth of phenomena penetration is achieved. See Diagram 1. Level 0.5. Lev 2. Level 1. Reality and comprehension levels. Diagram I Level 4. Level 5. The term Western means white. Western has become a comfortable, and for some, confusing, obfuscating euphemism or code for the word white. The terms Western civilization and Western culture specifically refer to the civilization and culture evolved, designed, directed, developed, and controlled by people who classify themselves as white. As mentioned in the color confrontation theory, white-skinned people, who lack any substantial level of permanent melanin in their skin, historically have contrasted themselves with all people in the world who have substantial, recognizable, and permanent levels of melanin. These skin-pigmented persons are referred to by the whites as non-white people, or when they are subdivided by the whites, they are referred to as BTACK, brown, red and yellow peoples. Non-white peoples collectively constitute the global numerical majority. This skin-pigmented global majority is genetically dominant to the genetically recessive whites, and genetically they can annihilate the whites. These facts are essential to a thorough understanding of not only alienation but anxiety and narcissism as well. One cannot comprehend alienation, anxiety, and narcissism as major phenomena in Western civilization and culture without an understanding of the origin of white-skinned people and their evolved thoughts and feelings, conscious and unconscious, about them. White skin is a form of albinism. There is no difference, microscopically speaking, between the white skin of a white person and the skin of a person designated as an albino. My central thesis here is that white-skinned peoples came into existence thousands of years ago as the albino mutant offsprings of black-skinned mothers and fathers in Africa. A sizable number of these black parents had produced, rejected, and then cast out of the community their genetic defective albino offspring, to live away from the normal black skin-pigmented population with the awareness of their rejection and alienation, as in leper colonies. The white tribe's eventual migration northward, to escape the intensity of the equatorial sun of the southern hemisphere, left the albinos eventually situated in the area of the world known as Europe now recognized. 23 is the home of the white tribes. This early rejection of the albino offsprings might be viewed as a prehistoric, pre-Western civilization, instance of parental rejection, child neglect, and abuse. Sexual intercourse between the isolated albino mutants produced a white race, understanding race as an isolated population sharing a significant number of common identifying genes. This pattern of isolating individuals with defective genetic patterns is no different than the present-day practice of placing genetically abnormal individuals in institutions, away from the normal population group. Another current practice is the isolation of those who are genetically different into ghettos, which is an exact parallel to the albino isolation. Support for my position is found in an article entitled Albinism, by Carl Witko, Jr., in the 1975 issue of Natural History magazine. Historically, people with various depigmeting conditions, including albinism, have occupied a spectrum of social positions, ranging from outcasts to semi-gods. Montezuma, emperor of the Aztecs at the time of Cortez's conquest, maintained a museum of living human biological curiosities. Prominent among these people were numerous albinos. Peoples with leprosy, which frequently causes a spotty depigmentation of the skin and hair, are described in biblical literature as the lowest outcasts. Among the San-Bias, albinos are semi-outcasts. They participate less in daytime tribal activity and are not permitted to marry. Biological investigations show that as a group they are somewhat smaller and their muscles are not as well developed as those of pigmented San-Bias star. Similarly, in his article entitled Kuna Moonchild Albinism, in the Journal of Heredity, Clyde Keeler notes, among other findings on albinism, the voice quality of albino males is soft and higher pitched than in Moreno, normal brown, males. In addition, they appear to be deficient in male sex hormone, and while they may be fertile, they have a lower phallic posture, due to flaccidity.